Alienated labor and the critique of political economy. Marx developed his theory of capitalist society through a critique of the theories of classical political economy. However, many features of Marx's work that are commonly identified as its central themes were already commonplace in political economy. Thus, Adam Smith had a thoroughgoing, so-called materialist conception of history, in which class relations emerge out of the mode of subsistence. The development of these relations is conditioned by the development of the forces of production, and the state is introduced to preserve the rights and property of the rich. Ricardo provided a more rigorous analytical foundation for this model, and in so doing produced a theory that could easily be interpreted by the Ricardian socialists as a theory not of class harmony, but of class conflict, in which profit derives from the exploitation of the laborer, and the development of the forces of production is held back by capital and landed property. Just as in feudal society, it had been restrained by the political power of landed and mercantile property. Thus, Marx relied heavily on Smith and Ricardo in his condemnation of the capitalist system in his economic and philosophical manuscripts and the poverty of philosophy. Clearly, what sets Marx apart from the political economists is not simply a so-called materialist conception of history or a so-called class conception of society. For versions of the materialist conception of history and the class conception of society are already to be found in classical political economy. According to the dominant interpretations, Marx's theories supposedly integrate the critical historicist perspectives of utopian socialism and of Hegelian idealism with the bourgeois materialism of Feuerbach's philosophy in the early works and of political economy in the works of his maturity. Marx's critique of political economy is then seen as an, quote, extrinsic philosophical critique, expressed from the standpoint of, quote, human nature in the early theories of alienation, and from the standpoint of the economic interests of the working class in the mature theory of surplus value. So the development of Marx's critique is seen as a move, for good or ill, from philosophy to economics. These interpretations can certainly find some textual justification, for Marx borrowed from a wide range of sources so that his early works, in particular, can easily be dismissed as an eclectic and contradictory mixture of borrowings and original insights. It is also true that the young Marx used the materialism of political economy as a stick with which to beat the idealism of Proudhon and the young Hegelians, at the same time as using the utopian communism of the young Hegelians as the basis of a critique of the, quote, cynicism of political economy. However, these interpretations isolate Marx's texts from the intellectual and political project which underlies them and gives them their coherence in relation to his work as a whole. Whether to dismiss Marx's early work as incoherent and unoriginal, or to appropriate his work for quite different projects. My aim in this chapter is to cut through this confusion, to locate Marx's early works in relation to his overall project. While the exposition of Marx's early work in this chapter is close to that of the few commentators who have stuck to Marx's text, particularly Cornu, 1934, Maceros, 1970, Chris Arthur, 1986, and the exposition, though not the interpretation, of McClellan, 1970. The interpretation is very different from those which dominate the literature. The assimilation of Marx's work to other projects is not surprising when we remember that the founders of Marxism all came to the works of Marx from quite different intellectual backgrounds, and saw Marx's work as the means of resolving intellectual and political problems which they brought with them. Moreover, the publication of Marx's text was in the hands of his orthodox interpreters. First Kautsky, and then the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So that those texts which did not endorse the orthodox interpretations were only published in the 1930s, as part of the still unfinished project of publishing Marx's complete works, and even then were not widely disseminated. The appearance of these subversive texts did not immediately lead to a re-examination of Marx's work as a whole. But rather, to the reinforcement of the orthodox opposition of Marx's youthful romanticism to his mature economism. The reinterpretation of Marx's work is perfectly legitimate, indeed is essential if Marx's work is to have a continuing relevance. However, the dominant interpretations of Marx's work, far from revitalizing Marxism, lose sight of the originality and critical power of Marx's critique of political economy. To reduce Marx to an ideologue of one or another brand of utopian or scientific socialism. But Marx's critique of political economy cannot be reduced to the simple task of reinterpreting the findings of classical political economy from a different class viewpoint, or situating them historically, or criticizing them morally, all of which had been done by previous thinkers, let alone to the narrow technical amendment of certain aspects of the labor theory of value. Marx's critique is, in fact, a total critique in the sense that Marx's critique is at one and the same time methodological, theoretical, and political, attacking the very foundations of classical political economy, in attacking the conception of society and of history on which classical political economy rests. Moreover, Marx's critique is not only a critique of political economy. Marx's critique is a critique of liberal social theory in general. At the same time, a critique of the capitalist society which liberal social theory serves to legitimate. It was really only with the reemergence of an independent socialist movement in the advanced capitalist countries in the 1960s that the orthodox interpretations of Marx's work began to be questioned. Much of this work of reinterpretation again involved absorbing Marx into contemporary academic debates within economics and sociology. as a means of introducing critical perspectives into a complacent conservatism. But Marx's texts also came to be seriously studied in their own right, and to be translated and published more widely. Selections from the early writings appeared in 1956 by Tom Baltimore and Maximilian Rubel. I think that was actually one of some of the first Marx I read personally. I think it was Marx's sociological text or something like that, but it was like maybe a 200-page compendium of various writings of Marx. It's one of the first things I read by the old son of a gun. The Grundrisse only appeared in French in 1968 and in English in 1973. The lost traditions of Marxism, lost because annihilated by Hitler and Stalin, embodying alternative political and ideological perspectives, began to be recovered. Works of Korsch in 1970, Isaac Illich Rubin, 1972, Hilferding, 1975, Pennacook, 1975, Grossman, 1977, Maddock, 1978, Bottom, Moore, and Good, 1978, Smart, 1978, Pashukanis, 1978. And Marx's work restored to the context of his own intellectual and political project, which had long been submerged beneath the polarization of social democratic reformism and Marxism-Leninism. It is these developments which have made it possible to recover the intellectual power and revolutionary significance of Marx's critique of political economy, and more generally of liberal social theory, to resolve this paradox of a critique which is both total and yet retains so much from what is criticized. The critique of Hegel's theory of the state. The first phase of Marx's critique of political economy was inaugurated by his economic and philosophical manuscripts. However, the foundations of this critique were laid in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Hegel's theory of the state starts from the observation that civil society is marked by egoism, by the particularity of individual interests. This raises an immediate problem, for civil society seems to lack any principle of cohesion. Civil society is merely a collection of individuals, all pursuing their own ends, and none with any immediate interest in the fate of the whole. Within civil society, individual existence alone is the goal, while social relations are simply a means. Among all the contending interests of civil society, there is no body that can rise above particular interest and represent the general interest of society as a whole. Indeed, any such body would be a contradiction in terms, for as part of civil society, it could express only particular interests. The principle of cohesion of society, the expression of the universal interest of all members of society and of their social character, can therefore only be something external to the particular interests of civil society, and that something is the state. The state stands above all particular interests as the embodiment of the universal. It was this principle which guided Hegel's search for the ideal form of state. The ideal form of the state is the form which most perfectly achieves the dissociation of the universal from the particular. The state will therefore be the embodiment of universality, detached from the particular needs and interests expressed in civil society, and so able to act as the disinterested regulator of the whole. Hegel posed the problem in essentially logical terms. For the ideal form of state is that form which is the most perfect embodiment of the logical category of universality. Thus, Hegel tried to deduce the most perfect form of the state by the application of his dialectical logic. The state so discovered is then the rational, and so ideal, form of the state. It just so happens that the form of the state that Hegel deduced in this way was a modified version of the Prussian state. Universality is personalized in the hereditary monarch and formalized in the constitution. The universality of the state is then mediated with the particularity of civil society through the system of representation. The starting point of Marx's critique of Hegel is his rejection of the conception of the individual on which Hegel's theory is based. Hegel sought to locate the individual socially and historically. However, this solution merely synthesized theories he sought to transcend. In seeing the historical development of the social individual as the outcome of a dialectic between an abstract individuality and an abstract sociability. For Marx, the individual is a social animal in a much more fundamental sense than this. For Marx, the individual is only a human individual within society, so that human individuality is a form of sociability. Human individuality being a form of sociability does not mean that the individual is simply the creature of society. For Marx rejects the categorical opposition of individual and society. Quote, above all, we must avoid postulating society as an abstraction vis-a-vis the individual. The individual is the social being, end quote. Marx. Hegel's individual is not a real person, but a philosophical abstraction which destroys that which it seeks to understand by taking away from the real person all those social qualities which make that person a human being. The other side of the abstraction of the individual from society is the abstraction of society from the individual. For Hegel, human sociability is not a property of real human beings, but is an attribute of reason. For Marx, by contrast, neither individuals nor society exist in the abstract. All that exist are concrete human beings, interacting in historically developed social relations, through which they define both their individuality and their sociability. The philosophical categories of individual and society are only the reflection of concrete historical categories. Whose relationship can only be understood historically. Thus, Marx's critique immediately points away from philosophy towards the study of historically developed social relations. Hegel's philosophical inversion of the relation between the abstract and the concrete means that his theory of the state inverts the true relationship between state and civil society. Universality is imposed on civil society by the state instead of being imposed on the state by civil society. Thus, for Hegel, the universality of the sovereign and of the Constitution derive not from their really expressing the universality of human sociability, but from the logical category of the universal. Having taken away the social qualities of real human beings, Hegel imposed those qualities on real human beings as an attribute of the state. Human nature is then a realization of the state, itself only the embodiment of logic, instead of the state being a realization of human nature. Hegel not only inverted the true relationship between the human individual and her social nature, between civil society and the state, between existence and reason, between the particular and the individual, between the particular and the universal. In so doing, Hegel reduced the particular to the universal, existence to reason, and so made the state into a purely formal principle, the expression of the logical category of the universal, and not of the real social needs of individual human beings. Thus, the universality of the state is purely formal, entirely abstract, and has no relation to the real content of society, human social needs. Hegel's argument is entirely spurious, for the particular cannot be deduced from the universal without specifying its particularity. Quote, an explanation which fails to provide the differentia is no explanation at all. The real subjects are and remain uncomprehended because their specific nature has not been grasped. End quote. For example, it is impossible logically to deduce hereditary sovereignty from the principle of universality. What Hegel really did was to describe a particular state of affairs on the one hand, and then assign logical attributes to this state of affairs on the other. He thus idealized existing reality, in the double sense that Hegel made reality the embodiment of the idea, and in so doing made the world as it actually exists in the only world that could rationally exist. Quote, thus empirical reality is accepted as it is. It is even declared to be rational, end quote. Marx. This is a travesty of reason, for, quote, the rational is seen to consist not in the realization of the reason of the real person, but in the realization of the moments of the abstract concept, end quote. Thus, Hegel's theory of the state is, quote, an uncritical mysticism, end quote, that does not understand the state as the expression of the social quality of human existence, but simply endorses the state as the state exists. Quote, at every point, Hegel's political spiritualism can be seen to degenerate into the crassest materialism, end quote, Marx. Hegel's philosophical inversion that reduces the state to an empty, formal abstraction was not for Marx merely an error of reasoning, for the state that Hegel describes really is only formally universal. The universality expressed by the constitutional state really is empty and abstract, for it does not emerge from the social needs of real human individuals. Thus, quote, Hegel should not be blamed for describing the essence of the modern state as it is, but for identifying what is with the essence of the state. That the rational is real is contradicted by the irrational reality, which at every point shows itself to be the opposite of what it asserts, and to assert the opposite of what it is. Hegel's error is to see the constitutional state as rational. I had to end the quotation. And to assert the opposite of what it is, end quote, Marx. Hegel's error is to see the constitutional state as rational. The contradiction comes to a head both in Hegel's theory of the state and in the constitutional state itself, in the system of representation. The system of representation gives the lie to the claim of the constitutional state to be the embodiment of universality. The system of representation is the focus of the contradiction inherent in the constitutional state because it mediates between the state and civil society. The representatives can express only particular interests. The mere fact of representation cannot transform these particular interests into universal interests. Thus, if the state is to represent the universal as opposed to the particular interests, the representatives cannot appear as representatives of particular interests, but only in their capacity as abstract individuals. Thus, insofar as the state is the expression of the universal interest, the state can only be such, the expression of the universal interest, by ignoring all particular interests, all real human needs. Quote, this point of view is abstract, end quote, atomistic, because, quote, the political state is an abstraction from civil society, end quote. Thus, if the state is to be a true state, that is, a true expression of the social quality that defines the humanist essence, and not simply an abstraction that is opposed to real human beings, the separation of the state from civil society must be overcome. The implication of Marx's analysis is that if human social qualities can be expressed only in the abstract and alien form of the constitutional state, this must be because they do not express themselves in civil society. It did not take Marx long to draw out this implication. From political philosophy to the critique of private property. In looking at Hegel's theory of the state, we seem to be a long way from political economy. At first sight, Hegel's idea of civil society might seem to have more in common with Hobbes than with Smith. While Smith has a materialist theory of the state, which, far from being the embodiment of the principle of universality, has a mundane origin in the desire of the rich to protect their property. However, for Marx, there was a very close convergence between Smith and Hegel that belies the apparent differences. Smith and Hegel were both concerned to discover the foundation of society in order to reform their own society, so that their society would accord with the dictates of reason. Both Smith and Hegel observed that civil society is based on egoism, albeit moderated for Smith, so that the coherence and unity of society's inherent harmony, is not immediately apparent. Thus, for both Smith and Hegel, the rationality of society could only be imposed on society from outside. While Hegel looked to the idea of universality to provide the rational principle of unity, Smith looked for the roots of reason in nature. Thus, while Hegel wanted to show the nation-state as the self-realization of the idea, classical political economy strove to see the capitalist economy as the self-realization of nature. While Hegel established the rational necessity of the constitutional state, classical political economy established the natural necessity of the capitalist economy. Both Smith and Hegel thereby abolished society, Hegel absorbing society into an absolute reason, Smith into an absolute nature. Thus, in each case, society is abstracted from humanity and attributed to some external force. It might seem that there is a world of difference between nature, which is, after all, something tangible, and Hegel's idea. But this is not really the case, as we saw in the last chapter. Smith's nature is not the tangible reality of nature. Smith's nature is a pure abstraction, an abstraction in particular from the social relations within which human beings appropriate nature. Thus, Smith's nature is as far from the everyday world of nature as Hegel's idea is from the everyday world of ideas. His materialism is purely abstract and is ultimately as idealistic as Hegel's philosophy. Against the common interpretation of Marx as a materialist, it is essential to be clear that Marx did not oppose materialism to idealism. Marx, following Hegel, believed that the opposition was a false one, since matter is no less idealist a concept than is the idea, so that, quote, abstract materialism is the abstract spiritualism of matter, end quote, Marx. However, Marx rejected Hegel's attempt to overcome the opposition by absorbing nature into reason, just as much as he rejected Smith's attempt to absorb reason into nature. Marx sought to overcome the opposition by focusing on society as the mediating term between the material and the ideal. But society understood not as yet another abstraction, but as the everyday practical activity of real human beings. It is the divorce of individual from society which underlies the false antitheses of the Enlightenment. In eliminating the mediating term between humanity and nature, between the ideal and the material, between subject and object. Thus, in his early works, Marx criticized materialism and idealism alike from the standpoint of, quote, human sensuous activity, practice, practical critical activity, human society or socialized humanity, end quote. First thesis on Feuerbach, characterizing his own position not as a materialism, but variously as a humanistic naturalism, or as a naturalistic or real humanism. Quote, consistent naturalism or humanism is distinct from both idealism and materialism, and constitutes at the same time the unifying truth of both, end quote, Marx. Similarly, Marx rejected the equally false antithesis between humanity and nature. Quote, society is the complete unity of man with nature, the accomplished naturalism of man, and the accomplished humanism of nature, end quote. A formulation which should not be interpreted as proposing society as the solution to a philosophical problem, but as transforming the problem from a philosophical problem to a socio-historical problem, and so defining a quite different project of investigating the relation between individual and society, between humanity and nature, within the framework of the historical development of concrete social relations. Marx's critique of both Smith and Hegel is that their theories are equally idealist in resting on the categorical opposition of matter and idea, individual and society, humanity and nature, oppositions which Marx argued were empty abstractions, empty because they are concepts which do not correspond to any determinate existence, and so can have no determinate effects. However, this is not only a critique of Smith and of Hegel, for these conceptual oppositions are constitutive of bourgeois thought in general, as they come down from the Enlightenment. In Hegel's work, bourgeois reason finds bourgeois reason's summation, and bourgeois reason's most systematic expression. The great merit of Hegel is that he has pushed bourgeois reason to its limits, so that bourgeois reason's speculative foundations stand out starkly in the contradiction between the universal and the particular, which Hegel can only resolve speculatively in the dialectical development of reason. In exactly the same way, Smith, and later Ricardo, recognize the real contradictions between universal human needs and aspirations and the particular social relations of the capitalist system of production, but again resolve these contradictions speculatively in the dialectical development of nature. Whether the superhuman force which makes history is called reason or nature is neither here nor there. Thus, Marx's critique of Hegel can be translated immediately into a critique of political economy, because Marx's critique of Hegel is a critique of Hegel and political economies' common ideological foundations. These ideological foundations lie in their attempt to present bourgeois social relations as the culmination of the synthesis of reason and nature. And it is precisely this that characterizes them, Hegel and political economy, as bourgeois. This is why Marx regarded Hegel's philosophy as the culmination and limit of bourgeois thought, and why Marx's critique of Hegel is a critique of the ideological foundations of all forms of bourgeois social thought. Marx could apply the method developed in the critique of Hegel's abstract spiritualism to the critique of political economy, because the theories were two sides of the same coin. Like Hegel, political economy is content to describe the alienated forms of social existence, attributing their social character not to their human origins, but to an alien power. On the one hand, the idea; on the other hand, nature. The origin of this alienation is in both cases the same. Smith and Hegel looked for this key to society outside the individuals who comprise it, because the immediate relations between these individuals appear as the synthesis of society. These relations are not truly human social relations, because they are based on the opposition of private interests. The focus of Marx's critique is this conception of private interests, which underlies the categorical opposition between individual and society, which, for Marx, is the hallmark of bourgeois social thought and the underpinning of bourgeois philosophy. For Marx, the opposition of private interest is not an expression of an atomistic individualism inherent in human nature. Human existence is only possible on the basis of cooperation, so that human interests are necessarily social interests, and human individuals necessarily social individuals. Private interests can therefore only be an expression of the, quote, privatization of socially defined interests. The opposition of privatized interests is constructed socially as the individual expression of a social institution, the institution of private property. It is the private appropriation of the means and products of social production. Which constitutes interest as private, exclusive, and opposed. Smith and Hegel, developing Locke's theory of private property, conceal the social foundations of private property, in conceiving of private property as ultimately deriving from a primitive proprietorial relation of the individual to her own body, and by immediate extension to the things produced by the exercise of her physical and mental powers. It is only by uncovering the origins of private property in human social activity that the alienation expressed by Hegel's idealism and by Smith's materialism can be traced back to its source. The critique of private property provides the key to the critique of both political economy and of Hegelian philosophy. Proudhon, Engels, and the critique of political economy. In turning to political economy, Marx was not simply trying to solve a philosophical riddle. His critique of political economy flowed from the same political inspiration that led him to the critique of Hegel's theory of the state. However, this political inspiration had acquired a new dimension. In the introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, written after the critique itself, Marx concluded that human liberation was not a philosophical task, but could only be achieved when philosophy became a, quote, material force. When, quote, theoretical needs correspond to, quote, practical needs. The theoretical need identified in the critique of Hegel was for the universal interest to conquer all particular interest in civil society. The, quote, practical need that corresponded to this is the need for a, quote, universal class. A class whose interest is opposed to all particular class interests. Quote, a class of civil society that is not a class of civil society, an estate which is the dissolution of all estates, end quote. And this class is the proletariat. Thus the proletariat, in liberating itself, liberates all humanity. The philosophical conclusion coincidenced. I don't know why the hell, that's not even a word. I don't know why I even said that. This philosophical conclusion coincided with Marx's discovery of and involvement in the real movement of the working class. And it was through this involvement that Marx came upon political economy. Within the working class movement, a critique of political economy was already emerging that showed some similarity to the form of critique that Marx had applied to Hegel. In France, Proudhon, in What is Property, had identified private property as the contradictory foundation of political economy. For Proudhon, political economy took private property for granted and tried to establish the rationality of a society based on private property. However, at every stage, political economy itself showed that private property undermines economic rationality by introducing inequality and monopoly. Thus, private property undermines the equality of the wage bargain, and indeed of all exchange relations. Proudhon argued that there is no moral or practical justification for this inequality, and concluded that a rational and just society could only be based on the establishment of equality by the equalization of property. The limitations of Proudhon's approach for Marx were that he isolated only one element of political economy for criticism, failing to recognize the connection between private property and the categories of wage labor, exchange, value, price, money, etc. Therefore, Proudhon wanted to abolish private property without abolishing the society which was based on private property. The equalization of property remains a form of property, a form, moreover, which is inconsistent with the continued existence of such phenomena as wage labor and exchange. Thus, as Marx wrote in The Holy Family, quote, Proudhon makes a critical investigation, the first resolute, pitiless, and at the same time scientific investigation of the foundation of political economy, private property, end quote. But it is still, quote, under the influence of the premises of the science Proudhon's critical investigation is fighting against, end quote. Thus, quote, Proudhon's treatise is the criticism of political economy from the standpoint of political economy, end quote, Marx. The work that first went beyond Proudhon in attempting to develop the critique of private property into a critique of political economy, and which had a dramatic impact on Marx's own thought, was Engels' Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy. Engels followed Proudhon. Engels, following Proudhon, identified private property as the uncriticized premise of political economy. The development of political economy has revealed, ever more clearly, the consequences of private property. But, quote, it did not occur to economics to question the validity of private property, end quote. Engels, therefore, sought to criticize this premise, quote, from a purely human universal basis, end quote. Although Engels took up Proudhon's starting point, Engels developed a much more radical analysis than that of Proudhon, in trying to show not simply the evils to which private property gives rise within an economy based on exchange, but in trying to show how private property underlies the entire economic system. Engels argued that, quote, the immediate consequence of private property is trade, end quote, which is immediately and necessarily antagonistic, based on, quote, diametrically opposed interests, and giving rise to, quote, mutual mistrust. Thus, although Smith preached the humanity of trade and the mutual benefits arising out of peaceful trade, the basis of trade remained egoism and distrust, and morality is subordinated to self-interest. From trade emerges the category of value, which is determined under the rule of private property by the conflict between producers and consumers, competition being the only way of relating utility to cost. The economist's concept of value tries to conceal the dependence of the category on private property by isolating value from exchange, reducing value either to production cost or to subjective utility, whereas the concept has no meaning in abstraction from the relation between the two in exchange. In the same way, the Ricardian theory of rent claims that rent derives from differences in the productivity of the soil, whereas it is in fact determined by, quote, the relation between the productivity of the land, the natural side, and the human side, competition, end quote. Let me repeat that sentence because I spaced out. In the same way, the Ricardian theory of rent claims that rent derives from differences in the productivity of the soil, whereas rent is in fact determined by, quote, the relation between the productivity of the land, the natural side, and the human side, quote, in the human side, competition, end quote. The division between capital and labor likewise derives from private property. For capital is merely stored up labor, the two being reunited within production only to be divided with the appropriation of the product. Capital is further divided again on the basis of private property into capital and profit. Profit splits into interest and profit proper. Moreover, the distribution of the product among these categories is not carried out according to some, quote, inherent standard. It is an entirely alien, and with regard to them, fortuitous standard that decides competition, the cunning right of the stronger, end quote. Engels' conclusion was that all categories of political economy presuppose competition and therefore exchange and private property. Private property, quote, private property splits, quote, production into two opposing sides, the natural and the human sides, end quote, as the land is appropriated by landowners. Human activity itself is divided between capital and labor, which confront one another antagonistically. Within these categories, too, private property introduces fragmentation, setting capitalist against capitalist and worker against worker. Quote, in this discord is consummated the immorality of mankind's condition hitherto. This consummation is competition, end quote. Engels. Engels finally returned to the standpoint of political economy, showing that, quote, contradictions of the competitive society arose out of competition, and so private property, the growth of monopoly, the disproportion between supply and demand, the coexistence of overwork and unemployment, the centralization of property, and the impoverishment of the worker are all the results of the system of competition based on private property. In abstracting from competition, the different schools of political economy abstract from the private property on which the system is based and conceal the roots of the contradictions inherent in the system. These contradictions are then either denied or attributed to external forces, as in the so-called law of population. Alienated Labor and the Critique of Capitalism. Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts, 1844, transformed Engels' critique from the perspective opened up by Marx in his critique of Hegel. Engels had shown how the categories of political economy and the realities to which they correspond presuppose competition and so private property, but he had not established the foundations of private property by showing how private property emerges out of human social existence. It is this critical task that Marx undertook. The key to this understanding was the relationship between private property and exchange. For Proudhon, private property subverted the essential equality of exchange. For Engels, private property and exchange were inseparable, but property remained the foundation of exchange. Marx inverted the relationship between the two, arguing that social relations of exchange are the basis of modern private property. This is the significance of Marx's famous theory of alienated labor. The interpretation of Marx's theory of alienation is not made easy by the fact that the manuscripts do not represent a completed work, but a series of notebooks in which Marx developed his own ideas alongside his earliest readings in political economy. Moreover, only the last 4 pages of the 43-page second manuscript, which immediately follows the first sketches of the theory of alienated labor at the end of the first manuscript, survive. There is therefore ample scope for creative interpretation of the theory of alienated labor. Nevertheless, when this theory is set firmly in the context of Marx's developing critique of political economy, its fundamental significance becomes clear. The bulk of the first manuscript is confused, unoriginal, and based on a very limited acquaintance with political economy. In this part of the work, Marx adopts, quote, the standpoint of the political economist, and does not advance significantly beyond Proudhon in pointing out, through extensive quotation from the political economists, the negative implications of the market society for the worker, whom political economy treats only as, quote, a commodity. Quote, it does not consider him when he is not working as a human being, end quote. Marx also noted the power of capital over labor, the fact that it is only competition that defends society against the capitalists, while competition necessarily gives way to monopoly through the concentration of capital. And Marx took great pleasure in attacking Smith's and Hegel's defense of landed property. It was in the last section of the first manuscript that Marx turned from political economy to political economy's critique. And the basis of the critique is the alienation of labor. Within a system of commodity production, quote, the worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces. Labor produces not only commodities. Labor produces itself and the worker as a commodity, end quote, Marx. The reason for this is that the product of labor has become, quote, something alien, a power independent of the producer. The more the worker produces, the greater the power that confronts her. This alienation of the product of labor is the expression of the alienated form of the activity of labor, something which political economy conceals, because political economy does not look at, quote, the direct relationship between the worker, labor, and production, end quote. The activity of labor is alienated in the sense that, quote, it is not the satisfaction of a need, it is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. External, end quote. It is therefore, quote, forced labor, not his own, but someone else's, end quote. This is labor as, quote, self-estrangement. From this follows the, quote, estrangement of the thing. That is, from nature as the product and as the object of production. Since labor does not flow from the needs of the individual, labor seems to be imposed by nature, in the form of both the object in which the laborer works and of the means of subsistence that impose the need to labor. Moreover, labor as naturally imposed individual labor is estranged from the species, from the participation in the conscious human transformation of the world of nature, and from conscious collaboration with other human beings. The first attempt to apply the theory of alienation, which Marx derived from Feuerbach and Moses Hess, to the critique of political economy, is familiar and has been the focus of almost all of the commentaries on Marx's manuscripts. Marx condemns alienated labor from the perspective of the needs of the laborer, as an individual and as a member of the human species. It is therefore very easy to interpret the theory of alienated labor as a direct development of the ideas of Feuerbach and Hess, proposing a, quote, anthropology of labor, which criticizes capitalism from the perspective of a particular conception of human nature, expressed in human needs. The modern version of this interpretation, derived from Lukács's theory of reification, written before the publication of the manuscripts, according to which the dehumanization of, quote, rationalized labor is confronted by the human aspirations deriving from the manual worker's, quote, humanity and his soul, end quote. History and Class Consciousness. an argument which Lukács later rejected as, quote, purely metaphysical construct, end quote. This idea was developed by Marcuse in his early review of the economic and philosophical manuscripts in 1932, which Marcuse assimilated to Heidegger's existential anthropology. Marcuse's interpretation of Marx was rapidly taken up by existentialist writers as the basis of a, quote, humanistic interpretation of Marx, which became very popular in the 1950s and 1960s, although since Marcuse's such an interpretation has become increasingly detached from Marx's text, turning more to Nietzsche and Kierkegaard as sources of inspiration. For Heideggerians, from Marcuse to Sartre, the soul is found in the remaining traces of authenticity, whether rooted in the unconscious, in the human will, in marginalized strata, or in the remoter realms of culture, which have thus far evaded the embrace of reification. More mundane developments of theory insisted that the evaluation of the subjective experience of the laborer is not a metaphysical but an empirical question. An observation which leads directly into social psychological interpretations of the theory of alienation. Marcuse's anthropological interpretation of Marx's early works, was extremely influential, not only amongst those who shared his existentialist perspective, but also amongst many of the critics of humanistic Marxism, who were led to reject Marx's early works as the products of an adolescent, quote, romantic individualism, or even worse, of a Hegelian, quote, essentialism, to be replaced by the, quote, materialism which underpinned the work of the mature Marx. Horkheimer, Adorno, and Habermas shared this interpretation, rejecting both the supposed anthropological perspective of the early Marx and the supposed positivism of his mature works. There's fireworks going on, so hopefully you can hear me. People are feeling patriotic today. The main problem which this interpretation faces is that Marx's critique of Feuerbach lay precisely in his rejection of any such essentialist anthropology, on the grounds that the human essence is developed historically and is not to be found in the individual psyche, underpinning a romantic yearning for a truer form of society, but in the form of historically developed social relations, however alienated may be the form in which they appear. As Marx noted in the sixth of his theses on Feuerbach, quote, human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality, the human essence is the ensemble of the social relations, end quote. Marx. Marcuse attempted to overcome this objection by locating the human essence historically. However, this attempt could not but fail, for Marcuse's human, quote, nature is only a critical force to the extent that it is not subsumed in the historical process. Thus, Marcuse's anthropology rests on the transformative power of human potentialities and human needs, which are unfulfilled by capitalism and which stand outside history. In sharp contrast to Marcuse's anthropological interpretation, Marx saw the unfulfilled human needs and aspirations, which led to the overthrow of capitalism, not as qualities hidden in the human soul, but as the creation of capitalism. For Marx, capitalism creates the means and possibility of liberating humanity from the rule of natural necessity, while making humanity the slave to a social necessity imposed through the alienated form of the rule of the commodity. There were certainly elements of romanticism in the young Marxist critique of alienated labor. But even in his early works, Marx focused as much on the evils of overwork, of poverty, and of exploitation as on the spiritual degradation of the laborer. Marx's first manuscript offers a powerful description of the dehumanization of labor under capitalism, but his brief discussion of alienation at the end of the manuscript is a slender basis for an interpretation of Marx, which contradicts almost everything else he wrote. Marx's description of alienation still begged the fundamental question, which was to get behind this alienation, to understand this alienation's foundations. Alienated labor and the critique of private property. The power of alienated labor cannot be a power inherent in the thing that is alienated. Ultimately, quote, only man himself can be this alien power over man, end quote. Thus the power of alienated labor. Alienated labor's alien, as opposed to its purely objective character, derives from the fact that it expresses a particular form of social relationship. It is at this point in his analysis, at the very end of the first manuscript, that Marx takes the decisive step, one which has bewildered most of those commentators who have not simply passed it by. Thus far, Marx has described the forms of alienated labor characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. He now seems to be moving smoothly into an explanation of alienated labor as the consequence of private property. In alienated labor, a social relation between people appears in the form of the subordination of a person to a thing. This social relation is the relation of private property, in which the capitalist appropriates the means of production as his private property, so permitting the capitalist to subordinate the laborer to his own will. Thus we find the, quote, hidden premise of political economy, already identified by Proudhon and by Engels. This explanation would be entirely in accord with the orthodox interpretation of Marx's so-called historical materialism, for which capitalist social relations are defined by the private ownership of the means of production, which implies that property relations are prior to production relations, and which also has the very embarrassing implication that, quote, juridical relations are prior to, quote, economic relations. However, this is not the step that Marx takes. Marx is quite clear that alienated labor is the cause and not the consequence of private property. Before labor can be appropriated in the form of property, labor must first take the form of alienated labor. Thus, the proprietorial relation between a person and a thing expresses a more fundamental social relation between people. The legal form of private property presupposes the social relation of alienated labor. Quote, thus, through estranged labor, man creates the domination of the person who does not produce overproduction and over the product. The relationship of the worker to labor creates the relation of it to it of the capitalist. Private property is thus the product, the result, the necessary consequence of alienated labor. Marx recognized that this argument may seem paradoxical, but he was unequivocal. True, it is as a result of the movement. He is unequivocal. Quote, true, it is as a result of the movement of private property that we have obtained the concept of alienated labor, of alienated life in political economy. But analysis of this concept shows that though private property appears to be the reason, the cause of alienated labor, private property is rather alienated labor's consequence. Later, this relationship becomes reciprocal. End quote, Marx. Marx's argument has certainly seemed paradoxical to his orthodox readers. Feuerlicht notes that, quote, one of the most conspicuous contradictions lies in the fact that young Marx considers private property sometimes as the cause and sometimes as the effect or symptom of alienation. End quote. Dick Howard tells us that in the passage quoted above, Marx recognizes that the argument, quote, seems to be circular. John Eliot, following David McClellan, in telling us that Marx's argument is, quote, generally recognized as a petitio principii, end quote, insisting that alienated labor and private property enjoy a mutual and indissoluble relationship. Marx here, presupposing a, quote, reciprocal influence, demonstrating, as in so many other instances, his commitment to mutual interpenetration rather than linear causation as his basic methodological perspective, end quote. If this were the case, alienated labor and private property would be the same thing, and Marx's theory would be vacuous, as many of his critics have claimed. However, Marx was quite clear what kind of relationship he was proposing, concatenating the terms, quote, reason, quote, cause, quote, consequence, quote, product, quote, result, quote, necessary consequence, to drum into the heads of his readers that he is talking about causal relationships, not the mishmash of so-called mutual interpenetration. Many commentators rely on Marx's supposed postulation of, quote, dialectical relations of mutual interdependence to explain away what Marx actually says, and suggests that Marx later reversed the position he took in the manuscripts. Ernest Mandel relates alienation in Marx's early works to the, quote, constant interaction between commodity production, division of labor, and private property, end quote, and to the division of society into classes, arguing that the mature Marx finally settled on private property as the foundation of alienation. Ernest Mandel follows Jahn. I'm going to assume that's Wolfgang Jahn, who I know nothing about really, except that he's somehow important to the critique of political economy in the post-war age, in explaining away the quoted passage by arguing that, quote, Marx is not dealing here with the problem of the historical origins of private property, but rather with the problem of private property's nature, and of how private property reappears daily in a mode of production based on alienated labor, end quote, ignoring the fact that it is precisely the, quote, nature of private property that is in question. Maurice Daub similarly argues that, quote, the treatment of alienation is double-sided, and it is a mere question of emphasis as to whether commodity production per se or appropriation of the product by the capitalists is regarded as the crux of the matter. Later, the emphasis is undoubtedly shifted to the latter, end quote. The emphasis is undoubtedly not shifted to the latter. In Capital Volume 1, which begins with the analysis of the commodity, Marx is quite clear that private property is only the expression of the alienated form of exchange of the products of labor as commodities. The property relation between, quote, whose form is the contract, is a relation between two wills which mirrors the economic relation. Here the two persons exist for one another merely as representatives, and hence owners of commodities, end quote. Messeros tries to resolve the paradox by distinguishing the historical origins of alienation from alienation's subsequent reproduction. Messeros explains that alienation of labor in terms of a primitive division between, quote, private property and private property's owner, end quote, and, quote, wage labor and the worker, end quote, arguing that such, quote, institutionalized second-order mediations, end quote, as, quote, exchange, money, etc., end quote, are, quote, already implied, end quote, in this primitive division. This leads him into a historical account of the development of alienation on the basis of the historical development of private property. Thus he refers to a, quote, three-way interaction between the division of labor, exchange, and private property. Although he goes on to recognize that, quote, private property is considered only as the product, the necessary consequence of alienated labor, because it presupposes that the worker is, quote, alienating himself from himself in the very act of production, end quote. Messeros. However, such an act presupposes the social relations of alienated labor, which brings us full circle. Messeros fails to resolve the problem because Messeros interprets Marx within a Hegelian perspective, which views society as a self-reproducing totality, driven forward by the dialectical development of the contradiction between wage labor and private property. i.e., within the alienated forms of labor, which makes it impossible for him to see anything but mutual dependence between alienated labor and private property. Chris Arthur, in his rigorous commentary on the manuscripts, follows Maceras in seeing private property as historically prior to alienated labor, while arguing that, quote, study of the movement of private property itself leads Marx to conclude that in its reciprocal relations with labor, it is ultimately best understood as the consequence rather than the cause of alienated labor. The state of estrangement between labor and private property is developed, historically and conceptually, to a process of active alienation of labor from itself, end quote. Like Maceras, Arthur does not explain why the relationship between alienated labor and private property, quote, is ultimately best understood as the consequence of alienated labor, end quote. Certainly, estrangement results from the, quote, active alienation of labor from labor's self, end quote. But for Arthur, it seems that this active alienation, in turn, results from private property. Maceras and Arthur do not penetrate beneath the alienated form of labor to see the fundamental contradiction between labor as the active agent of production and labor's alienated commodity form, which explains both its foundation and the possibility of its overcoming. Although Marx's theory of alienated labor has been willfully or unwillfully misinterpreted by almost all the commentators, it is the very foundation not only of his critique of political economy and of Hegel's philosophy, but also of his critique of the presuppositions of liberal social thought in general. It was this insight which Marx later acknowledged, quote, served as a guiding thread for my studies, end quote. Private property is the hidden presupposition of liberal social thought, because it is private property that constitutes the abstract individuality of the bourgeois subject, the individual having been isolated from society through her private appropriation of the conditions and products of her social existence. If Marx's critique had remained a critique on the basis of private property, as the orthodox interpretations would have it, it would have remained like that of like that of Proudhon. I don't know why I even said Ricardo. Like that of Proudhon, a critique on the basis of political economy, and, more generally, within the limits of bourgeois social thought. But if the relations of private property between a person and a thing is only the juridical expression of a social relation between people, the abstract individual subject of bourgeois social theory is found to be only a philosophical abstraction, expressing particular social relations of production. The starting point of philosophy and of social theory has to be not the abstract individual, whose social qualities are concealed behind a property relation between the individual and a thing, but the historically developed social relations which characterize a particular form of society. Marx's apparently innocent argument that private property is the result of alienated labor has a devastating implication, for it undermines the apparently a priori character of the fundamental categories of bourgeois thought. Alienated labor and the critique of money. The conclusion that Marx immediately drew from his critique of private property is fundamental, and it moves a long way from Proudhon. If alienated labor is the basis of property, the abolition of property can only take the form of the abolition of alienated labor. Thus, the emancipation of, quote, the emancipation of society from private property, etc., from servitude, is expressed in the political form of the emancipation of the workers, and not that their emancipation alone is at stake, but because the emancipation of the workers contains universal human emancipation, end quote. Marx. Thus, the problem that arose out of the critique of Hegel's theory of the state finds its practical solution. Having discovered the essence of private property in the alienation of labor, Marx argued that every category of political economy is, quote, only a particular and developed expression of these first elements, end quote. However, Marx did not follow up this suggestion immediately, not least because at this stage he had a very limited knowledge of political economy. The evidence suggests that it was at precisely this moment that Marx turned to the serious study of political economy for the first time. Instead, Marx turned to the most fundamental question of all. If private property is the consequence of alienated labor, we have to look elsewhere for the cause of alienated labor. Quote, how can we ask, does man come to alienate, to estrange his labor? End quote. Marx. However, it is at just this point that 40 pages of Marx's manuscript are missing, freeing creative commentators from the inconvenience of pinning their interpretations to Marx's text. Almost all those who accept Marx's argument that alienated labor is the basis of private property go on to argue that the foundation of alienated labor is to be found in the division of labor, which would imply that alienation is a universal phenomenon. Bert Ullman tells us that, quote, the division of labor occurs, and the division of labor brings alienation in its wake. The further the division of labor develops, the more alienation approximates the full-blown form alienation assumes in capitalism. For Marx, alienation exists in all societies where the division of labor is the operative principle of economic organization. Walter Weisskopf offers the same interpretation, as does John Maguire. It is picked up in almost identical terms in a recent textbook. Quote, the root of all forms of alienation, he considered to be alienated labor, caused by the specialization of activity, end quote, which is, quote, most intense in systems based upon commodity production, and especially in capitalism, end quote. Howard and King, 1985. Others include the division of labor among a number of different causes of alienation, for example, Ernest Mandel. John Eliot adds the division of labor, quote, mutually interwoven with private property to the, quote, interpenetrating, end quote, causes, while characteristically quoting a passage which says the opposite, quote, the division of labor is the economic expression of the social character of labor within alienation, end quote. Marx. This last quotation makes it clear that Marx saw the division of labor as an expression of alienation, not alienation's cause. The confusion arises from a misreading of Marx's use of the term labor in his early works. In the early works, Marx consistently used the term labor as synonymous with alienated labor, and, quote, division of labor as synonymous with the fragmentation of alienated labor, so that the identification of alienated labor with the division of labor is a tautology, not the expression of an explanatory link. More generally, far from contradicting essential human needs, the division of labor is for Marx the manifestation of the human sociability, which Marx regarded as humanity's defining feature, even when the division of labor appears only in an alienated form. Thus, it is quite clear in Marx's account that it is not the division of labor that is the source of alienation, but the social form of the division of labor, in which the social character of labor is only realized through the form of the exchange of labor power and its products as commodities. It is the analysis of the commodity that is the key to the explanation of alienation. Despite the gap in the manuscripts, we do have another text which, the evidence strongly suggests, was written after completion of the first of the manuscripts and before Marx got to work on the second. This text is made up of Marx's excerpts and comments on James Mill. Although the comments were first published alongside the manuscripts in 1932, the comments on Mill did not appear in English until 1967 and have received little critical attention. Marx's earliest references to alienation had focused on money as, quote, the estranged essence of man's work and man's existence, end quote, arguing that, quote, this alien essence dominates him and he worships it, end quote, from On the Jewish Question. An idea which derived from Moses Hess's conception of money as, quote, the alienated power of man, the product of the mutually alienated men, the alienated man, end quote, through which, quote, the human potential is alienated and degraded to a mere means of making a living, end quote. The comments on Mill return to the crucial category of money and start by taking up Mill's account of money as a means of exchange, which for Marx, quote, very well expresses the essence of the matter, end quote. In emphasizing that the essence of money is not that it is a form of private property, but that it is a medium of exchange which embodies, in an alienated form, the mutual complementarity of the division of labor. Quote, the essence of money is not in the first place that property is alienated in money, but that the mediating activity or movement, the human social act, by which man's products mutually complement one another, is estranged from man and becomes the attribute of money, a material thing outside man, end quote. Marx. It is only on the basis of this role of money as means of exchange that money acquires its, quote, real power over what money mediates to me, end quote. So that, quote, objects only have value insofar as objects represent the mediator, whereas originally it seemed that the mediator had value only insofar as the mediator represented them. This reversal of the original relationship is inevitable. This mediator is therefore the lost, estranged essence of private property, end quote. Marx. It is only because money is constituted as the abstract form of alienated labor in its role as means of exchange that alienated labor can take on the independent form of private property as money. Private property is therefore no more than the juridical expression of the mutual recognition of commodity producers in the exchange relation. The significance of this apparently simple observation can be best brought out by contrasting it with Engels' analysis of exchange. Engels saw the exchange relation as a conflict between two wills, and so a transparent relation that political economy had distorted by concealing its presupposition in private property, moving the focus from money as a form of private property to money as a means of exchange, which was achieved within political economy by Hume's critique of mercantilism, leads to a quite different view of exchange as a mediated relationship, in which the exchange is effected not directly, but through the medium of money. Seen in this light, private property is no longer the presupposition of exchange, but is rather exchange's result. It is only when the activity of social labor is expressed in the alienated form of money that the product of that labor is detached from the human activity that produced it and assumes the form of a thing which can be appropriated as private property. Thus, the problem of explaining private property becomes the problem of explaining the alienation of labor in the form of money. In the rest of the comments on Mill, Marx develops the implications of this fundamental insight, deriving the categories of political economy not from private property, as Engels had done, but from capitalism as a form of social production, whose social character is only expressed in the alienated form of the exchange of commodities under the rule of money. In the society based on exchange, the quote, human community appears in the form of estrangement. To say that man is estranged from him, therefore, is the same thing as saying that the society of this estranged man is a caricature of his real community, end quote. On the basis of commodity exchange, an individual comes to assess all her capacities not in their own terms, but in terms of money. In the same way, the significance of others for the individual is assessed in money terms. Thus, all human qualities are reduced to qualities of the thing, money. Which detaches them from the individual and makes them into an objective power. As human qualities are reduced to things, so human relations are reduced to relations between things. In the system of exchange, human needs are not related to one another directly, but the relation is mediated through the alienation of human activity in the form of money, which thereby acquires an independent existence as private property. I do not orient my activity to the needs of another, thereby directly expressing my awareness of my social nature. Instead, my need is related to a thing that is the private property of the other, and the need of the other is related to my private property. Thus, my social need for the other is expressed in the form of my need for the thing that the other possesses. In this way, the essential social relationship between people's mutual need for one another, appears in the alienated form of a relation between things, and my social dependence on the other person appears in the alienated form of my dependence on things. With the extension of exchange and the division of labor, the activity of labor becomes an alienated activity. For the thing that the laborer produces has no inherent connection with the needs of the laborer. The laborer does not produce the particular object, because that particular object responds either to her need to engage in a particular form of activity, or to a need for that particular product, or to a recognition of the need of another for that product. The laborer produces simply in order to exchange the product for another product, in order to earn a living. Thus, the product as an individual, indifferent thing comes to dominate labor. All the misunderstanding of Marx's theory of alienated labor derive from the failure to grasp the insight first achieved in Marx's comments on James Mill. The orthodox commentaries identify alienated labor as the expression of an unmediated relation of labor under the domination of another, whether in capitalist production or through the division of labor. Instead of locating alienated labor as a specifically capitalist form of labor, which is marked precisely by the fact that the worker has been freed from immediate relations of domination. Thus, capitalist private property is distinguished from feudal landed property by the fact that capitalist exploitation is not direct, but is mediated by the commodity form of labor, and the commodity form of labor's products. It is only this mediation of social relations by things that defines the alienation of labor and constitutes the product of labor as private property. Consequently, the worker does not, quote, alienate himself from himself in the very act of production, end quote, but in selling her labor power as a commodity. Alienation is not simply an ideological or psychological phenomenon through which the power of private property is concealed behind the things which are the substance of that property, to be overcome by the acquisition of a true consciousness of class exploitation. In a capitalist society, things really do have the power attributed to them by the alienated consciousness. What has to be understood is not who is hidden behind the mask of the commodity, but how commodities acquire social powers as the alienated powers of social labor. This is why it is only on the basis of the analysis of the commodity form that it is possible to understand the more developed forms of private property, in particular money and capital. The comments on James Mill provide only an indication of the direction in which Marx's thought was moving. In particular, the analysis remains at the level of commodity and does not have any account of the social relations of capitalist production. Thus, although Marx indicates that, quote, the relationship of alienation labor reaches the relationship of alienated labor's highest point only when he who buys the product is not himself a producer, end quote. Marx still seems to follow Smith in seeing this relationship as a linear development of the division of labor, so that the domination of capital over labor is not a qualitatively different social relation from that of commodity exchange, but only the culmination of the domination of money. Quote, the complete domination of the estranged thing over man has become evident in money, end quote. Nevertheless, the comments we can see Marx taking, in the comments on James Mill, we can see Marx taking the decisive step which enables him to go beyond Proudhon's, quote, critique of political economy on the basis of political economy, end quote, by discovering in his analysis of the form of commodity exchange as the act of alienation, the secret of private property. From this point onwards, the emphasis of Marx's account of alienated labor shifts from the subjective experience of alienation and the relationship between the individual and private property to its historical foundation in the relationship between the, quote, real community and the real community's, quote, estranged form. From a philosophical critique of capitalism to a historical critique. This perspective informs the bulk of the third manuscript, which is made up of a critique of those forms of communism that have not been able to go beyond private property because they have not grasped private property's essence, and of a polemical discussion of the dehumanization of alienated labor, the division of labor and money, This discussion brings out the powerful moral dimension of Marx's critique of political economy. Political economy offers a theory of capitalist society that rests on a resolutely naturalistic materialism, for which the human being is reduced to an animal stripped of all human qualities, whose needs are reduced to the biological need for subsistence. Political economy does not concern itself with human moral qualities, but political economy still, quote, expresses moral laws in its own way, end quote, Marx. These are the moral laws of the society that it describes. And for Marx, at this stage of his thinking, political economy gives an accurate account of the reality of capitalist society. The critique of political economy, which shows that it is on the basis of the particular social form of alienated labor, and not of an impoverished human nature, that this dehumanizing a society arises, is therefore at the same time a moral critique of capitalist society. However, this is not an abstract moralism referring back to moral truths hidden in an unrealized human nature. The moral critique is only an expression of the contradictory form of capitalist social relations, as the estranged form of human sociability, an estrangement which is already expressed theoretically in the contradictions inherent in political economy, which both recognizes and denies the human foundation of society and social labor. Within the reality of capitalist society, true human needs remain, which will and must express themselves in the overthrow of capitalism and capitalism's replacement by a society in which labor will be immediately social, in which the state as the alienated form of sociability will be abolished, and in which religion will be superfluous. This moral critique is interesting, if very abstract. More significant from the point of view of the development of Marx's critique of political economy is the theoretical conclusion he draws at the beginning of the third manuscript. We have seen that Engels' critique of political economy stopped short of an analysis of private property and criticized political economy from the standpoint of the market. For Engels, an adequate political economy must be based on the market, where object and subject, producer and consumer, objective costs of production, and subjective utility meet one another. What Engels offered was a synthesis of the competing schools of political economy. In this sense, anticipating not Marx, but Alfred Marshall, and not ultimately a critique of all at all. Marx, however, as soon as he had found the basis of private property in alienated labor, concluded that labor must be the basis of political economy, and so he came down firmly on the side of Ricardo and Ricardo's labor theory of value. It is significant that this is the first point in his work in which Marx had anything positive to say about Ricardo, whose so-called cynicism he had hitherto regarded with contempt, and whose work he had not thought it worth reading. Now Marx notes that, quote, there is not merely a relative growth in the cynicism of political economy, from Smith through Say to Ricardo, Mill, etc., These later economists also advance in a positive sense constantly and consciously, further than their predecessors in their estrangement from man. These later economists do so, however, only because their science develops more consistently and truthfully. End quote. The attraction of the labor theory of value for Marx was not that the labor theory of value, quote, proved that the laborer was exploited under capitalism, which the labor theory of value did not and could not do, but that the labor theory of value connected labor with labor's alienated forms. For Marx, the great advance of Smith over mercantilism was to recognize property not as something external, money, but as a form of labor, a view which is most rigorously developed by Ricardo. However, political economy inverts the true relationship between labor and property because it does not recognize that labor is inverted in the form of alienated labor. Instead of seeing alienated labor as the human essence of property, political economy sees labor as the natural form of property. Quote, political economists make private property in its active form the subject, thus simultaneously turning man into the essence. The contradiction of reality corresponds completely to the contradictory being which they accept as their principle. End quote. Marx. Thus Marx rediscovered the inversion that he found in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of the state. And it is not surprising that the final section of the economic and philosophical manuscripts returns to the critique of Hegel. Hegel and the critique of political economy. The economic and philosophical manuscripts owe much more to Marx's engagement with Proudhon and Hegel than to any thorough exploration of political economy. However, the insights gained in the critique of alienated labor laid the foundations on which Marx developed his mature critique of political economy. In this sense, there is no break between the, quote, philosophical works of his youth and the, quote, economic works of his maturity, between the, quote, abstract critique of 1844 and the, quote, historical critique of 1867. To see how this can be, we need to go back to the question of the affinity between Hegel's philosophy and the doctrines of political economy, to which Marx returns in the final manuscript. Hegel's philosophy is, quote, mystical for Marx, because Hegel's philosophy presents the real as rational by suppressing the irrationality of reality. Thus Hegel describes real contradictions, but then dissolves these contradictions again in the development of self-consciousness by turning reality into an attribute of thought. Nevertheless, the power of Hegel's system is that his ruthless attempt to reduce everything to reason leads him to uncover real irrationality. even if for him such irrationality is simply another logical problem. The quote, rational kernel can be extracted from Hegel's philosophy as soon as it is recognized that the contradictions Hegel describes are real contradictions which demand a real solution. Thus, Hegel's theory of the state recognizes the contradiction between the particularity of interest in civil society and the universality supposedly embodied in the state, but treats this as a formal contradiction to which he provided a formal solution. For Marx, this is a real contradiction which calls for a real solution. The abolition of a society based on the opposition of private interests. In exactly the same way, political economy describes the real contradictions inherent in capitalist social production between the enormous growth in the productive power of social labor and the social and material impoverishment of the laborer, which appears in the contradiction between the restricted value of labor power and the value created by the expenditure of that labor power. But even Ricardo, the most rigorous and honest exponent of political economy, provides only a formal solution to this contradiction. The parallel between Hegel and political economy is not only methodological. The substantive connection between Hegel and political economy is, as we have seen, to be found in the common idea that private property is based on the private appropriation of the products of labor, so that labor is the substance of property. Labor being the substance of property is not an idea unique to Smith and Hegel, but an idea that is fundamental to liberal social thought, emerging with the development of bourgeois production relations as an aspect of the secularization of bourgeois property. It is an idea that is developed first in political theory, classically in Locke's explanation of the origins and foundations of property. It is then taken up by classical political economy, which considers bourgeois social relations to be simply an aspect of the division of labor. Participation in those social relations as laborer, landowner, or capitalist, depending on the form of property as labor, land, or capital. The idea is given its most rigorous and abstract formulation in Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind. For Hegel, the private appropriation of the products of labor was the basis of property and therefore the basis on which social relations acquire an objective reality, embodied in things, beyond the immediacy of interpersonal relations. For Hegel, the alienation of the object in exchange is simply the means by which the character of the product of labor, as private property, already established in the act of labor, is affirmed by others. However, to become private property, the object must be more than a product of labor. The object must be an object which is detached from that object's producer, and so has acquired its independence before that object can be appropriated as property. Hegel's identification of alienated labor with objectified labor suppresses the real contradiction implied in the alienation of labor and that underlies bourgeois property. The contradiction that explains Hegel's identification of alienated labor with objectified labor suppresses the real contradiction implied in the alienation of labor that underlies bourgeois property. The contradiction that explains how it is that the product of an individual's labor can be appropriated by another and turned into the means of subjection of the direct producer, to reduce alienation to the subjective recognition of the equivalence of the object of exchange as private property. Marx's analysis in the manuscripts starts with the real contradiction as the basis on which to develop his concept of alienated labor. Marx's critique of Hegel can be applied directly to classical political economy, because the two theories of capitalist society rest on the same concept of property. Thus, as Marx noted in the manuscripts, quote, Hegel's standpoint is that of modern political economy, end quote. Engels had already brought the two together in his critique of political economy, which betrays a strong Hegelian inspiration in showing the dependence of all the concepts of political economy on this fundamental presupposition of private property. However, Engels could not get beyond a moral critique that condemned bourgeois property for bourgeois property's inhuman consequences. Although Marx's critique retained this strong moral thrust, it also went beyond this strong moral thrust to establish the socio-historical foundations of bourgeois property, and so to reveal the real possibility of bourgeois property's historical supersession. Thus, Marx's critique of political economy is a moral critique. But it is much more than a moral critique. Marx's critique of political economy is a philosophical critique, but it goes beyond philosophy in revealing the real historical foundation both of bourgeois social relations and of the mystifications of bourgeois ideology. Hegel's identification of alienated with objectified labor conceals the real foundation of bourgeois social relations, and so is the basis on which those social relations are mystified. If private property derives from the objectified labor, then it is the necessary consequence of the production of objects. It has a natural foundation and a universal existence. If private property derives from alienated labor, however, then it has a social foundation. In a particular social form of labor, and a purely historical, that is, transitory existence, where political economy naturalizes bourgeois social relations by attributing bourgeois social relations to the natural powers of objectified labor, Marx located bourgeois social relations historically by attributing them to the social power of alienated labor. Behind alienated labor as a philosophical category lie the particular social relations of production. Hence, the philosophical critique immediately gives way to a socio-historical critique. It was this step that Hegel was unable to undertake. Quote, the outstanding achievement of Hegel's phenomenology is that Hegel conceives the self-creation of man as a process, conceives objectification as loss of the object, as alienation and as transcendence of this alienation. That Hegel thus grasped the essence of labor and comprehends objective man. True because real man as the outcome of man's own labor. The weakness of Hegel's work, however, is that, quote, all estrangement of the human being is therefore nothing but the estrangement of self-consciousness. The estrangement of self-consciousness is not regarded as an expression reflected in the realm of knowledge and thought of the real estrangement of the human being. End quote. Marx. This means that Hegel's philosophy is ultimately an uncritical criticism. For although Hegel's philosophy recognizes the alienation of labor, it recognizes the alienation of labor only in a formal, speculative, alienated way. Thus, quote, Hegel's standpoint is that of modern political economy, end quote, in that, quote, Hegel sees only the positive, not the negative side of labor, end quote. Marx. The critique of Hegel and the critique of political economy are ultimately one and the same. The critique of the constitutive presupposition of bourgeois thought. Marx's early critique of political economy. The manuscripts laid the foundation for a series of works produced in the 1840s, most of which were polemical in intent. Rather than go through these works in detail, I will summarize the achievements and limitations of Marx's early critique of political economy, as that was developed in the works written between 1844 and 1848, before the revolutionary upsurge interrupted his studies. Marx's early critique of political economy was based on a philosophical critique of political economy's fundamental concepts. However, even in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, it is clear that Marx was going beyond philosophy. The concept of, quote, alienated labor is not simply a philosophical concept, nor is alienated labor seen primarily as a moral or psychological attitude to labor. Behind the abstract concept of so-called alienated labor, sometimes there's like a quote, a single word or phrase in quotation, and sometimes it's kind of used to say, like, when you put it in scare quotes, it's like kind of like sarcastic or as they say, but that's not how it's used in this case. So I apologize for the horrible slip up on this piece of audio that 5 people will listen to if I'm lucky. Behind the abstract concept of alienated labor is a real concrete specific historical form of labor. The critique of private property is not merely a philosophical critique. For it is clear that for Marx, property develops historically on the basis of the development of alienated labor. Marx's moral condemnation of the alienation and dehumanization of labor was not based on his own beliefs about human nature and human dignity, but on human needs expressed in everyday human existence. It is in an alienated form these human needs are expressed in religion and in politics. But these human needs are expressed directly in the community. In the past, the community provided a very narrow and limited response to those needs. For Marx, the community that is emerging within capitalist society, out of the association of the proletariat, will be a universal community which will satisfy human needs directly, and so, at last, the alien forms of politics and religion will disappear, along with the narrowness of community. Thus, even in the manuscripts, quote, alienated labor is not primarily a philosophical, moral, or psychological concept. Alienated labor is a socio-historical concept. It is in this sense that there is no break between the manuscripts and Marx's later work. The later work develops directly out of the counterposition in the manuscripts of the real world of human practical activity to the abstractions of bourgeois social thought, a counterposition that is expressed in the argument that alienated labor is the specific socio-historical foundation of bourgeois social relations. It was this perspective which informed Marx's reading of political economy between 1844 and 1848, and which underlies the critique of political economy to be found in the works of that period. The main contribution of the works of this period, 1844 to 1848, is that Marx develops a critique of the social relations of capitalist production. The central theme of this critique is that political economy is based on the, quote, naturalization of historically specific social relations, and so political economy's concepts are formulated in abstraction from the specific historical characteristics of capitalist society. In this sense, they are, quote, formal abstractions. Political economy abstracts from the social fact of land ownership to present rent as a quality of the land. Political economy abstracts from the social form of wage labor to present wages as the recompense for labor. Political economy abstracts from the social form of capital to present profit as a quality of the means of production. Political economy abstracts from the social form of exchange to present exchange as an expression of a rational/natural propensity to, quote, truck, barter, and exchange, end quote. However, this is an illegitimate form of abstraction, for it is only in a particular form of society that land generates a rent, means of production a profit, and labor a wage. It is only in a particular form of society that the private labor of individuals is related through exchange. To treat these categories in abstraction from their social form is to deprive them of any content. To make the categories into purely formal categories that exist wherever there are latent labor means of production or cooperation. Thus, the categories of political economy are given an eternal status, and are even applied to societies within which neither wages, nor profits, nor rent, nor exchange actually exist. Marx's critique of political economy is not merely an historicist critique, which stresses the historical relativity of the concepts of political economy, such as was developed by the German historical school. Underlying this historicist critique is a theoretical critique whose foundation is the critique of private property. For political economy, it is not only private property that constitutes individuals as social beings, by defining individuals socially as the owners of factors of production. Land, labor, and capital are regarded as cooperative, so-called factors of production, distinguished from one another by their distinct functional roles in production, corresponding to the technological distinction between the object, instrument, and means of labor. In the course of the development of the division of labor, the functional roles of these factors of production are separated from one another, just as the functional roles of the butcher and the baker are separated. This separation corresponds to the appropriation of these distinct, so-called factors of production, as private property by different individuals, which establishes an immediate correspondence between the technically imposed relations of cooperation between the factors of production and the social relations between people. Private ownership simultaneously constitutes Sorry, I got distracted. Private ownership simultaneously constitutes the factors of production as sources of revenue, and so defines the particular interest of distinct social classes on the basis of the mode of their participation in the distribution of the social product. Thus, wages flow from labor to the owner of labor, profits from the means of production to the owner of the means of production, rent from land to the owner of land. Political economy can recognize that class interests conflict with one another. Smith provided a devastating critique of the antisocial instincts of the capitalist, and Ricardo of the regressive character of land ownership. However, this recognition is confined within the limits of political economy's, quote, naturalization of capitalist social relations of production, and the limits of capitalism are the natural limits of the diminishing returns to capital and land. Conflicts of class interest necessarily follow from the private appropriation of the means of production. But for political economy, production relations are technically imposed cooperative relations between the factors of production, while class conflicts are confined to the level of distribution and are resolved through competitive exchange. The political economist's concepts derive from private property as a philosophical abstraction. For political economy, private property cannot arise out of society. As the historical product of human sociability, since it is only private property that makes society possible. This means that the explanation of private property can only lie outside society. As an expression of natural inclinations, human rationality, or divine will. In this abstraction, a particular form of property, capitalist property, is given a universal status. It is only through this universal category that the recipients of revenues are related to their sources of revenue. History is then simply the history of the liberation of private property from the unnatural fetters imposed by political power and by religious and sentimental prejudice, fetters that prevent revenues from flowing to their appropriate recipients. For example, in feudal society, the landowner uses his political power to secure not only his rent, but also the, quote, profits, and even a portion of the, quote, wages of the serf. The effect of the formal abstraction of political economy, based on its concept of private property, is to attribute social powers to things, inverting the subject and the predicate. Thus, instead of seeing the machine as a particular embodiment of capital, political economy sees capital as a particular manifestation of the machine. Instead of seeing labor as the physical substance of commodity wage labor, political economy sees wage labor as a particular manifestation of labor. Instead of seeing the, quote, propensity to truck barter and exchange, end quote, as a need imposed by exchange, political economy sees exchange as an expression of this so-called natural propensity. This formal abstraction cannot be reduced to a methodological error, for the inversion is something that really exists in capitalist society. The abstraction of political economy leaves out of account the social form within which things come to acquire a social power. So it attributes this power to the things themselves. But in a capitalist society, things really do manifest this social power. Thus, workers really do find them slaves to their physiological needs and to the means of production. Capitalists really do acquire profits in accordance with the productivity that capitalists attribute to their means of production. Landowners really do earn rents in accordance with the relative fertility of the soil. Exchange of things really is the only way in which producers relate socially to one another. Political economy reproduces uncritically the alienated social forms of capitalist society, within which social powers are mediated through things, so that social powers appear as the attributes of things. The mystifications of political economy do not simply represent an ideological inversion of reality, but the ideological expression of a real inversion. This is why the critique of political economy is not simply a critique of mystificatory ideology, but of the alienated forms of social life, which political economy describes but cannot explain. It is because political economy is uncritical of its presuppositions, most fundamental of which is private property, that political economy's analysis mystifies the foundations of capitalist society. In denying the social character of its fundamental categories, political economy makes these categories into eternal truths that can be distorted by unwise political intervention, but that can never be suppressed. In turning its fundamental categories into eternal truths, political economy makes the society to which these categories correspond itself an eternal truth. For political economy, capitalist society is the best of all possible societies, because it is in terms of the categories of capitalist society that political economy evaluates all forms of society. Marx's critique of political economy reveals the socio-historical content of the formal abstraction of political economy by revealing the socio-historical foundation of bourgeois property and alienated labor. Bourgeois property rests on the coordination of social production, not through the self-conscious organization of production on the basis of human need, but through the exchange of products of private producers in the form of commodities. The commodity is thus a specific social form of the product of labor. Similarly, wage labor is a particular form of labor which corresponds to the dispossession of the laborer, that forces the laborer to work for another, who has appropriated the necessary means of production and subsistence in the form of capital. Thus, wage labor and capital are the complementary aspects of a particular social relation of production. It is only within this social relation that capitalists and wage laborers relate to one another as independent commodity owners. And it is only within this social relation that the laborer is compelled to alienate her productive powers in exchange for a wage. It is only within this social relation of production that property based on labor is transformed into its opposite, the appropriation of the product of labor by the non-laborer. The limits of the early critique. The limits of the early critique. Although the manuscripts defined Marx's intellectual project, it would be quite wrong to see Marx's mature works already present in Nusa, in the works of his youth. In the manuscripts, Marx had cut away the foundations of the old edifice, but the edifice itself remained intact. This explains why, in the place of the intrinsic critique which his project mapped out, Marx fell back for polemical purposes on an extrinsic critique. In his polemical works, Marx still tended to combine a Hegelian critique of the naturalistic empiricism of political economy with a materialist critique of the speculative idealism of the Hegelians. This was almost inevitable to the extent that he had not yet shown concretely how the standpoint of alienated labor transformed the concepts of political economy, nor how the standpoint of human practical activity transformed the concepts of Hegel, by developing his own historical analysis of the development of the capitalist social relations. In his early work, Marx did not contest the scientific adequacy of classical political economy as a theory of capitalist society. In the first manuscript, it is through the findings of political economy that Marx condemns capitalist society. In The Holy Family, 1844-5, Marx used the findings of political economy against the left Hegelians, while arguing that contradictory ideas express contradictions in reality. The contradictions developed by political economy, expressing the contradictions introduced into the real world by private property, so that these contradictions cannot be overcome philosophically, but only by the real abolition of private property through the self-emancipation of the proletariat. Excuse me. In the Poverty of Philosophy, written in 1847, Marx used Ricardo's proof of the futility of reform to berate Proudhon's reformism, arguing, quote, that Ricardo's theory of values is the scientific interpretation of actual economic life. Ricardo establishes the truth of his formula by deriving his formula from all economic relations, and by explaining in this way all phenomenon, even those like ground rent accumulation of capital and the relations of wages to profits, which at first sight seems to contradict it, is precisely that which makes his doctrine a scientific system. End quote. Marx. Poverty of Philosophy. The tension between political economy and political economy's critique appears most clearly in the German Ideology, written 1845 and 1846, in which Marx first attempted to present his conception of history as the history of private property. To be more precise, Marx offers three separate and rather different but equally unsatisfactory attempts. The problem is that Marx's approach to history remains abstract, for he has no coherent account of the historical development of alienated labor as the expression of different social forms of production. Marx's so-called historical materialism tends to take the form of an abstract dialectic of labor underlying the historical process, manifested in the parallel and continuous, rather than contradictory and discontinuous development of the division of labor and private property, in which all differences are accidental, to be shed in the unfolding of the dialectic, which culminates in the final confrontation of labor and capital. In the manuscripts, Marx still followed Hegel in seeing property as an abstract and homogeneous category, which only reaches property's developed form in capital. Thus, quote, landed property is private property, capital, still afflicted with local and political prejudices. Capital not yet fully developed, end quote. This abstract conception of property persists in the German ideology, combined with the idea derived from Smith of the history of society as based in the development of the division of labor. Instead of providing an analysis of the historical development of different social forms of labor as the foundation of the development of different forms of the division of labor and different forms of property, Marx tries to integrate the so-called materialist conception of history developed by the 18th century materialists, in which it is the progressive development of the technical division of labor that governs the historical development of society, with an idealist account of history as the development of property from property's early forms, in which it continued to be restrained by political, communal, and moral considerations, to property's purest and most rational form as modern private property. The problem with this attempt to integrate a quasi-Hegelian account of the development of property with the materialist account of the development of the division of labor is that of establishing the relation between the two. In the terms of subsequent Marxist debate, the problem is that of the relationship between the development of the, quote, forces and the, quote, social relations of production. In Marx's first account in the German ideology, he follows Smith in arguing that, quote, the existing stage in the division of labor determines also the relations of individuals to one another with reference to the material, instrument, and product of labor, end quote. But in practice does not establish any coherent connection between the two, forms of property being related to forms of social organization, quote, tribal, quote, ancient communal, quote, feudal, with no reference to the division of labor. This is a promising lead which Marx immediately abandons, only taking it up again in the section on pre-capitalist economic formations in the Grundrisse. In his second account, he ties the development of the forms of property more closely to the development of the division of labor, but loses sight of the social form of production, so reducing property to, quote, the identical expression of the division of labor. It is the separation of town and country that gives rise to the separation of capital and landed property, while a class division arises in the towns, quote, which is directly based on the division of labor and on the instruments of production. Quote, which is directly based on the division of labor and on the instruments of production, end quote. German ideology. Thus, Marx falls back into political economy's identification of forms of property, not with social forms of labor, but with the physical substance in which property is embodied, land, labor, and means of production, so that property remains an ahistorical abstraction, on the basis of which class relations follow directly from the division of labor, and property develops from, quote, naturally derived capital, end quote, to capital, quote, having its basis only in labor and exchange, end quote. The result is that the critique of property remains equally abstract and ahistorical. For the contradiction between private property and the division of labor, between the, quote, social relations and the, quote, forces of production, has disappeared. The third presentation does not escape from this perspective, but resurrects the contradiction, although in an entirely formalistic way. Thus, Marx argues that, quote, private property was a necessity for certain industrial stages, end quote. But that, quote, in big industry, the contradiction between the instruments of production and private property appears for the first time, end quote. Because for the first time, quote, the totality of the productive forces, end quote, confront, quote, the majority of the individuals from whom these forces have been wrested away, end quote. Chris Arthur, notes a difficulty which this account of the development of private property establishes for Marx's claimed analytical priority of alienated labor over private property, since feudal landed property is not based on alienated labor, but on relations of personal dependence. But this discontinuity in the history of private property is not so much a problem for Marx's theory of alienated labor as for the quasi-Hegelian idea of history as the unfolding of a dialectic between labor and private property, which Messeros and Arthur draw from the German ideology. Feudal landed property is manifestly not an impure or undeveloped form of capitalist property. It is a quite different form of property, expressing quite different social relations of production, a form of property which, far from being private, is encumbered with a network of social relations of dependence and obligation. Capitalist forms of private property did not emerge out of feudal forms, but in opposition to feudal forms, the struggle between the two being a long drawn-out and bloody one. Marx soon saw the way to move beyond the philosophy of history, which informs the German ideology. In a very important letter he wrote to Annenkov as early as 1846, in which Marx made it quite clear that the critique of private property was the key to the critique of both bourgeois society and bourgeois social thought, Marx stressed the discontinuity between bourgeois and feudal property as expressions of quite different social relations of production. Quote, property, finally, forms the last category. I don't know if I said quote. Quote, property finally forms the last category in Proudhon's system. In the real world, however, the division of labor and all the other categories of Proudhon are social relations, and their totality forms what is currently called property. Bourgeois property, outside these relations, is nothing but a metaphysical or legal illusion. The property of another epoch, feudal property, developed in a series of entirely different social relations. Proudhon, in establishing property as an independent relation, commits more than one methodological fault. He proves conclusively that he has not grasped the thread which connects all the forms of bourgeois production. End quote. Marx. Letter to Annenkov, 28th of December, 1846. Similarly, Marx soon recognized in his other works of the 1840s that his critique of political economy transforms the economist category. Thus, quote, money is not a thing. Money is a social relation, end quote. Quote, machinery is no more an economic category than the bullock that drags the plow, end quote. Quote, rent results from the social relations in which the exploitation of the land takes place. Rent is a product of society and not of the soil, end quote. But Marx did not follow this insight through. Marx's critique of political economy remains a, quote, external critique, which put political economy in its historical place, but which left the substance of political economy intact. Quote, economists express the relations of bourgeois production, the division of labor, credit, money, etc., as fixed, immutable, eternal categories. Economists explain how production takes place in the above-mentioned relations. But what economists do not explain is how those relations themselves are produced, end quote. But Marx did not explain this either. The result was that the radicalism of Marx's theoretical critique was not realized in practice in his early works. Thus, the Communist Manifesto of 1848 still has remnants of the philosophy of history sketched out in the German ideology, in proposing historical laws whose foundation appears to lie outside of history. The 1859 preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy contains a much-quoted summary of the findings of Marx's early works, which can easily be read in just such terms, which are also the terms of Engels' popularization of Marxism in Anti-Düring. In a different vein, the political writings of the 1850s provide sophisticated journalistic accounts of historical events, with occasional programmatic asides, but without any systematic theoretical analysis. The critique of political economy was incomplete until the critique of political economy had been transformed from external philosophical and political critique, which establishes the limits of political economy by revealing its hidden presuppositions, into an internal theoretical and historical critique, which could provide a more adequate theory of capitalist society in order to lay bare the quote, laws of motion of capitalist society as a historically developed mode of social production. Marx had to reformulate the classical concepts of wages, rent, and profits, and the classical laws of production, of population, of currency, of the determination of revenues, and of the falling rate of profit in properly historical terms. Even in the 1840s, Marx was well aware of the need to develop the positive side of his critique, but he repeatedly postponed writing his economics under the pressure of political and personal circumstances, until he returned to his economic studies in 1857. It was in the Grundrisse, 1857 to 8, that Marx first began to develop his intrinsic critique of political economy. From one perspective, the Grundrisse is a thoroughly confused and eclectic mixture of philosophy and political economy, both in the context of the project mapped out in the manuscripts. The Grundrisse provides the, quote, missing link between Marx's earlier works and those of his maturity. The need to develop his analysis more rigorously arose out of the need to distinguish his own theory from Proudhon's eclectic synthesis of Hegel and political economy, and specifically out of the need to develop a rigorous analysis of money, which Marx had identified as the key to the critique of private property in his earliest works. To counter Proudhonian proposals for monetary reform, in order to give substance to his critique of Proudhon, Marx took up the theory of alienated labor as the basis of a critique of the labor theory of value, which is the foundation of Proudhonian reformism, which brought him once more face to face with political economy. In the course of the Grundrisse, Marx distinguished his own analysis from that of Proudhon by progressively filling his philosophical categories with social and historical content. The critique of political economy is no longer a philosophical critique based on an extrinsic conception of human nature, but is an immanent critique. The contradictions of political economy being located within political economy. These contradictions can only be resolved by reformulating the concepts of political economy, whose contradictions can then be explained as the expression of the historically developed contradictions of the social form of capitalist production.